not only that, but this book is also recommended by Barack Obama, so it's checking all of the boxes. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. I realised that I probably should have filmed my mid-year roundup at the end of June or beginning of July, so like a month ago, because that technically is the midpoint of the year, but oh well. I personally see my birthday at the end of July to be like the midpoint of the year because I'm a Leo and the world revolves around me. So this is when we are doing my mid-year roundup and you just have to deal with it. So I believe so far this year I've read like 55 or 60 books, which is like a lot considering last year I read about 10 and the year before that I read maybe 2 that weren't related to my degree in some way. So overall, a vast improvement, and I'm pretty proud of myself, not gonna lie. Hello, it's Liv from the future here, just editing this video, and I just wanted to come on and confirm that as of right now, it's August 2nd. This is how late this video is coming out. As of right now, I have read 69 books this year. Nice. And also, I don't think I mentioned this when I originally filmed this video, but so far this year I've only rated 3 books 5 stars, and obviously those books are going to be included in this video, but that is where we are at right now. So I thought today I would take you through some of my least favourite and most favourite books that I have read so far this year. So I'm going to start off with my 5 least favourite books this year, and in at number 5 I have chosen The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. This has definitely been one of my biggest disappointments this year. I started this book thinking that it was going to be a feminist retelling because that was how it was marketed to me, that was how I saw it, basically. That was why I bought it and started to read it. But that's really not what it is. It is a retelling of the Trojan War, but it's not designed to be feminist in any way. Yes, it starts off in Briseis' point of view, and that is how most of the story is told, but partway through it just suddenly comes in with like certain chapters from Achilles' point of view, and those sections kind of get more and more frequent leading up to Achilles' eventual death. And those sections, when they came in, like really threw me for a loop. Because personally, I didn't really see the point in adding them in. Like, were they meant to make Achilles appear more sympathetic, even though most of the story is told from the point of view of the woman he's literally keeping as a slave? If Pat Barker had intended to write a book depicting a real, unromanticized account of what female prisoners of war would have undergone in the Greek camp, it feels kind of counterintuitive to allow a male character to interrupt that kind of story. I'm not saying that this is a badly written book because the prose itself is actually very well written, but I do think that if you're going to write a retelling of a myth that is retold as often as the Trojan War is, I think you need to ask yourself why you want to tell the story again. What are you going to add to this vast canon of retellings by telling your own story? And if your answer is, I'm going to tell this story from the perspective of the very first character named in the Iliad, then maybe you just need to rewatch Troy 2004. I feel like this is a really harsh review, and if you like this book, I'm sorry, you can like this book, but it did take me 3 attempts over like 2 years to finish this book, so I am holding a little bit of a grudge. My 4th least favourite book this year was The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides. I should have looked up how to pronounce his name before I started recording. Eugenides, it's Eugenides. Eugenides, nuts.
Stop it.
This was another disappointing book for me. I'm not sure exactly what I was expecting from it, but it wasn't what I read. It's essentially 250 pages of a group of adult men who for decades have been obsessing over 4 sisters who used to live on their street and ended up committing suicide when they were all teenagers. Again, I'm not faulting the writing. I like that The narration was in first person plural, so you really got the sense of this mob mentality of this group of boys into a group of men. And I also liked how the house of the girls was kind of used as a pathetic fallacy for their states of mind. As the house gradually fell into disrepair, the family inside gradually fell apart. But outside of that, this book just seemed to be a romanticization of mental illness and suicide, and the targets of that romanticization were for underage girls who desperately needed help, but they never got any, and that just kind of made me uncomfortable. So overall, it was a well-written book, but I just didn't particularly enjoy the experience of reading it. At number 3 is Regretting You by Colleen Hoover, and this is the first Colleen Hoover book on this list, but it is not the last. I do want to make a longer video about all of the Colleen Hoover books that I've read, so I won't go into a lot of detail here, but in summary, Regretting You was just painfully mid. The two main characters' points of view were pretty much indistinguishable from each other, which was slightly concerning because one of these characters is like twice the age of the other. So you would hope that she would have a slightly more mature train of thought, but honestly they both sounded like teenagers. The plot was just the characters making bad decision after bad decision, and it honestly could have been resolved in about 50 pages had they just talked to each other like grown-ups. And honestly, I just didn't really care about any of the characters anyway. I'm not even sure if I can remember their names. The main two were called Morgan and Clara, and the mother's love interest was called Jory? Jason? Jonah? It was a J name, definitely. And the teenager's love interest was like Mason, or some like really like dude bro name. But as I said, it wasn't the worst Colleen Hoover book that I have read. That is yet to come. But that was Regretting You by Colleen Hoover. At number 2, we've got Helen of Sparta by Amalia Carosella. This is another mythological retelling, and maybe I rated this and The Silence of the Girls lowly because my standards for mythological retellings are so high, as we'll see later in this video. My main issue with this book is that it tries to romanticize the story of the abduction of Helen of Sparta by Theseus. Now, Theseus was a contemporary of heroes like Heracles, Peleus, who is Achilles' father, Nestor, who at the time of the Trojan War is like a really old man. So he's going to be quite a bit older than Helen, even if his demigod status prolongs his life a little bit further. In this book, Theseus is 48 years old and Helen has just turned 15 when they meet.
Boom. A child. No.
And Carosella tries very hard to make Theseus appear to be the best and most appealing option for Helen by making her parents constantly misunderstand her, having Menelaus be an abusive prick, and also by giving Helen a level of intelligence and maturity that goes far beyond her 15 years. A lot of really, really awful stuff happens to her. She goes through a lot of trauma in this book, and she handles it with a lot of maturity that I don't think many 15-year-olds would have, even if they were brought up with the expectation that they would one day rule over a city. And it makes it appear like Helen and Theseus are on a very similar level intellectually, when really this is a story about a man and a child. What the Anyway, there were parts of the book that I did enjoy, mostly the stuff that didn't involve the romance, but I just can't get behind a book that romanticizes that kind of story, no matter how long ago it was set or how normal that kind of age gap would have been back then. And coming in at number 1, my least favourite book that I have read so far this year, and honestly I really don't think it's going to lose that top spot in the next 5 months we have Ugly Love by Colleen Hoover. No surprises here. Again, I'll do a full summary and review when I eventually do my co-home video, but in short, any book that contains the line "we both laugh at our son's big balls" is immediately going to book jail for life. no parole. Miles is very much a walking red flag, which Tate recognises several times, and yet she gives him an infinite number of passes just because she wants to have sex with him. And there were also parts of the book that were very casually aphobic, like Tate says that everyone obviously wants love and sex because it's human nature. And I'm sure that this aspec erasure was not intentional at all, mostly because I'm not convinced that Colleen Hoover knows that aspec people exist. But it was still a massive ick reading that, so I could go on about how much this book sucked, but I want to move on to the positives as quickly as possible. So, without further ado, let's move on to my favourite books that I have read so far this year. At number 5, we have Babel by R.F. Kuang. This book catered to a lot of my interests: language, dark academia, criticising the traditional elitist model of university. Despite it being a fantasy book, it remains so rooted in the reality of 19th century England that it still managed to be a very eye-opening and insightful and interesting commentary on how colonialism has had lasting effects on all aspects of traditional British society. Let it be known that I'm really not a fantasy person, but the magic system in this book was so clever and well integrated into the real world that I did at times forget that I was reading a fantasy book. It was really, really good magical realism. I can fully understand why this book might not be for everyone. Like, the first half of the book is pretty much all exposition, and the second half is more action focused. So if you're not as interested in translation theory as I am, then you might potentially struggle to get through the first half of the book, and that's perfectly okay. I personally had to take a break from this book for about a month when I got halfway through, just because I was feeling quite burned out and I just wanted to read something completely different. And then after a month, I came back and read the second half within like 3 days and loved it. It's not to everyone's taste, but it really was to mine, and I loved it. My fourth favourite book so far this year was Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I love reading about space almost as much as I love reading about Greek mythology. I'm sure in another life I would have become an astrophysicist or something. Maybe if I hadn't watched Gravity when I was like 13. And I saw that Jack Edwards had read this book and loved it. And not only that, but this book is also recommended by Barack Obama. So it's checking all of the boxes.
He knows Barack. I love Barack. I'm swiping right.
Ryland Grace, who is the main character and narrator, has this really witty and sarcastic and charming internal monologue. And he loves science, and he loves teaching and space, and that really comes through in his narration. And he's just all around this decent person who happens to be an unlikely savior of humanity. Honestly, the closest thing I can use to describe the narration style is like if Ryan Reynolds was narrating this book, partly as Deadpool and partly as his character in Free Guy. Like, that's just Ryland Grace, essentially. And this down-to-earth narration style really helped when Ryland started talking about a lot of complex, complicated sciencey stuff that typically goes into reading a science fiction book. Without that, this book could have run the risk of being quite dense and condescending, but as it is, it's just generally really entertaining. I really don't want to spoil anything else because I feel like it's a book that is best gone into not knowing a massive amount. So overall, it's just a really wholesome, funny, hopeful read. And we are now into my top 3. In at number 3, we've got 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes, because of course there is a Natalie Haynes book in this list. This is one of the best examples of a feminist retelling that I have ever read. The Silence of the Girls wishes it was this book. It tells the story of the Trojan War from the perspective of the women who are affected by it. And when I say the women who are affected by it, I mean all of the women. There are so many perspectives crammed into this book, from the more well-known women like Cassandra and Penelope to the ones that typically get forgotten like Laodamia, who is the wife of the first man killed at Troy, or Oenone, who is the first wife of Paris, who is just left on Mount Ida when Paris goes to abduct Helen. all of these women are treated with such respect and dignity because in a way they are all also heroes, even though almost none of them actually fought in the battles. My favourite parts include Penelope's letters to Odysseus, which gradually get more and more frustrated and sarcastic the longer he stays away from Ithaca, and Calliope's interludes, which are a bit meta in the way that she wrenches control of the story away from the bard that she's inspiring, so that her song focuses not on the male heroes of the story, but actually on the women who suffered at the hands of those heroes. Overall, this is a really, really well crafted book and definitely one of my all-time favourite retellings. My second favourite book this year is This Is How You Lose the Time War. It's about two rival agents working for opposite sides of a multiversal war across time and space, communicating with each other through letters and eventually falling in love. And that's all I'm going to tell you about the plot, because as I said in my last video when I read and reviewed this book, it's best gone into knowing absolutely nothing and just expecting some of the most romantic, heart-wrenching, beautifully crafted prose ever. The vibes are immaculate. The plot is kind of confusing, but I also think that's half the fun of reading this book. And I don't typically tend to reread things, but I honestly see myself reaching for this book again in a few months just to feel the things that I felt while reading it. And my number one of the last 7 months, my favourite book that I've read so far this year is Bunny by Mona Awad. What I wouldn't give to wipe my memory and read this book the first time again. It's another book where it's kind of confusing and you're not 100% sure what's going on, but the vibes are incredible. Like, reading it feels like a psychedelic experience. It's another dark academia-esque book that follows a girl who gets inducted into this clique of girls who write poetry and call each other Bunny and perform weird cultist rituals. It's one of those books where you're expecting to read one thing, but it turns into something completely different and you have to just go along for the ride. It's a weird and trippy book, but I am so here for it, and now I just want to read everything that Mona Awad has written. And that's it. That was my 5 favourite and 5 least favourite books that I have read so far this year. If you read any of these books that I've talked about in this video and you have thoughts, then please leave them down in the comments. If not, tell me about your favourite book that you've read so far this year, or your least favourite book that you've read so far this year. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you again in the next video. Bye!